Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Cruising your way on this episode of Off 90. We observe the process of creating an encaustic painting. We visit an ethnic Polish museum in Winona. We learn about the history of teachers' strikes in Minnesota. And we meet a couple from Rochester who have a unique collection of toasters. It's all just ahead, Off 90. Hi, I'm Barbara Keith. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Off 90. Encaustic painting, otherwise known as hot wax painting, has been around for centuries, but it's an art form that's not very common. We met with Beth Sievers, an encaustic painter from Rochester. She told us about her attraction to encaustic painting and showed us how it's done.
Well, usually they come by and they look at it and then they kind of stop and they look at it again, and I can see that they're trying to figure out what it is, and so then they'll come closer and then they typically want to start touching it because they're trying to figure it out, and then when I tell them it's beeswax, they're always pretty surprised. I'm Beth Sievers and I'm an encaustic artist. Encaustic is art made with beeswax and tree resin, and then you add either oil or powder pigment to it. Well, I first encountered encaustic painting about 10 years ago, and when I was just looking at the internet at different paintings, and when I saw it, I immediately fell in love with it. So I typically work with 3 pancake griddles going, and I have different cups of the different colors that I'm going to use to make the art. And I need to always make sure that the paint brushes are made of animal hair, otherwise if they're plastic they'll melt. So I get everything heated up and get my surface ready to go. Sometimes I'll put a couple layers of plain wax down if I want to really build it up, but for this piece I'm not going to do that because I want the wood to come through. So I apply it, and then each layer that I apply I need to heat gun because that fuses the layers together, and so that increases the durability of the piece. I would say with encaustic, nothing ever turns out how I plan for it to go. And part of that's because of the wax, but part of it is each layer has to be fused together with a heat gun or torch. And depending on how close you get or how far away you are, it's always going to either melt more than I expected it to or melt a little bit less than I expected it to. And so I feel like that really helps me explore and do new things that I probably wouldn't have thought of doing otherwise. What I really enjoy about encaustic painting is the depth that it gives to paintings. You can make texture really easily. You can build it up, or you can make it a smooth surface. It's a fairly quick process in my opinion. I used to do stained glass, which took a really long time, so in comparison, encaustic art takes considerably less time. Well, I get a lot of people asking me if it's a new art form because they've never seen it before, but actually it's ancient. It was originally made by the ancient Greeks for the sides of their ships to make them more durable, so they added the beeswax, and then the tree resin is what makes the beeswax more durable. And then they added pigment to it and started painting with it. And then the ancient Egyptians used it in their tombs on their mummies, and they did very intricate portrait paintings of people who had died. I would say that doing art is a stress relief for me. During the day, I work in healthcare as a clinical nurse specialist, And so when I come home and I'm able to do art, it's a time for me to decompress.
Everybody knows that the populations of early settlements in the Midwest were mostly made up of immigrants. Winona was no exception. In the 19th century, a large segment of Winona's population was originally from Poland. The mission of the Polish Cultural Institute and Museum in Winona is to collect and exhibit the heritage of the Polish culture.
When people usually get to the museum, they are taken aback by the size of it, by the sheer amount of stuff that we have. And that's why on a lot of travel websites, they're calling it Winona's Hidden Gem.
This guy right here, number 20. I'm Father Paul Breza. I'm a priest for the Diocese of Winona, so I've been sent and stationed at different areas, Blooming Prairie, Mankato, Rochester. And I was gone from Winona for basically about 48 years. But all that while I kept in touch with Winona, and especially the Polish community, and I began to realize that history was an important thing in Winona, but not any Polish history. You know, we have history. So somebody better start saving this before it's too late. The reason why Polish people came here to start with is unknown. That's lost to history. And that's part of the reason why I needed to start saving that, because we were losing history quickly. We had a lot of history in Polish, but we're now 5 generations removed. The only thing we can piece together is the fact that there were some jobs here with the sawmills, and they were hiring, they needed a lot of help. And we are the same climate and water area, lakes and rivers and hills, and the same trees, same mushrooms that we have in Poland as we have here. So by the 1870s is when the mass immigration from Poland to immigration to the States took place. And in the 70s, 6,000 Polish people left an area 25 miles in diameter, which is quite small, and moved across the Atlantic and settled in an area 25 miles in diameter right here.
Well, I think it's important for this history to be preserved just because it's in such decline, and it's declining so fast that if this place wasn't around here, this town would no longer be Polish. You know, people wouldn't have any sort of idea of their forefathers, where they came from, what they did for a living.
We had this language barrier. So when we came over here, that's why we all settled together in one area, close to the sawmill where the work was. But you couldn't get a job selling things, you couldn't answer the phone, couldn't answer the door. You couldn't do anything that you would have to be qualified for, so you couldn't be a school teacher, you couldn't be a storekeeper, you couldn't be anything except someone who could take directions by visual. Here, put this over here. That kind of job you could do. So we stacked lumber, took lumber away from the saw blades, you know.
The reason why a lot of this history was lost was when the immigrants first started coming over here, and even in the later years, they didn't teach Polish to their children. They wanted their kids to be as Americanized as possible. So when the parents or grandparents passed and you have children that don't speak the Polish language and you get all these artifacts, you know, they're basically worthless to them, so they began throwing them away. And from the very beginning, from the very start of the museum, there were boxes outside of the door, people donating stuff, and you will take anything, basically Polish related, we'll take.
The collection started by people bringing things in or me going out to rubbish barrels picking them up. Well, there was a librarian that came from Poland one time and archived just the books that I had and was totally impressed because I have probably 30 books where there might be 2 or 3 copies of those in the whole world. And there's 5 books that no one else has anyplace. So just because he saved them and they were from such a small area.
Okay, in here, this used to be a vault, and we now have our dolls that people donate.
We run on volunteers. We don't charge to get in because I always thought that the concept of the museum was we're saving the history of people who were poor when they made the history. You know, I got the stuff free. I'd like to have it for free.
This was donated, and it cranks up. I came to work here because we needed people to work, and I wanted to do something for the museum to give back to my Polish people, the heritage. So I just decided that's what I was going to do when I retired.
The description of us in Poland from 200 years ago, even before we started to move here, and here, is that we are persistent to a fault. You never, ever give up, ever, for anything. And it gets you in a lot of trouble because you don't know when to quit. I tried to have something in this museum and this business that could make sense out of that Polish spirit.
Father Briza received the Cavalier Cross, which happened 2 or 3 years ago, and that's actually the highest civilian honor that a Pole can get. And he was presented it by the Chicago Council from the president of Poland, which was really cool, and in appreciation of him keeping up with the history of Polish Winona, basically. It's nice for people to come through and actually be able to not just see a tractor, but to be able to see who the tractor belonged to, you know, what it was used for, what farm it was on, whether it was in Winona or Dodge County, Pickwick, and any of those things. Like, we're a museum less about artifacts and more about the story behind the artifacts.
They'll come in and kind of be awestruck because how'd you put all that together? The kids who have worked with me would say, did you have a plan before you started so you would know it would end with this? No. You would get something, then you had to figure out where it would go and how it would fit, but still make sense out of what you had.
What I hope for the future for preserving the Polish Museum would be that more people recognize this place for what it truly is, for the hidden, beautiful gem that Winona actually has, and in the museum itself, and in the people that work here. We're extremely friendly. That's one of the Polish things. Friendliness is our #1 priority, basically. And I just hope that we can keep growing, keep expanding. I don't want to see it come to an end.
One frigid winter day, Michael Ressman found himself picketing outside the school where he worked and wondered, how did we get to this point? Eventually, Mike wrote a book about the subject called Bad Blood in Economics, a history of teacher strikes in Minnesota. We talked to Mike about what he learned while writing his book.
The first organized teacher strike in the country occurred in St. Paul in 1948. I was kind of surprised to find out how many teacher strikes there have been in the state, and I was able to document 71 teacher strikes. But 35 of those occurred the same fall, the fall of 1981, which was the first year that teacher strikes became fully legal. So if you take away that 35, 36 left is not that many for a total. I'm Michael Resman. I'm a writer and an amateur historian. I wrote a book called Bad Blood in Economics, A History of Teacher Strikes in Minnesota. Well, this book started out back in 1991 when I was a teacher in special education in Rochester, but I found myself standing in the snowbank with a wind chill of 54 degrees below zero because we were on strike. And I didn't understand what the union was telling us, and even what the newspaper was reporting didn't make sense to me, that why this was so important. And so I wanted to find out the story behind the story. And I couldn't do that until after I retired, but then I started digging into the history, and I went statewide for teacher strikes in Minnesota. I titled it Bad Blood in Economics because from some of the early teacher strikes, a professor up at Bemidji wrote an article, and he labeled those two reasons for teacher strikes and explained why, and it certainly made sense. There were strikes that were purely economic, and they were settled fairly quickly and with not much acrimony. There are other strikes where prior to the strike, the teachers and the school district were very close in salary, but they went out on strike sometimes for a prolonged period with a lot of anger afterwards that lingered for decades in some cases. So there were those two reasons. There was economics and bad blood that caused the strikes, and sometimes both. Proctor, for example, had two teacher strikes, one in 1981 and one about 8 years later. But both of them only lasted like 3 days, and the district people and the teachers commented that there was very little anger afterwards. It was just purely on money, no personalities involved, no threats. Both of those were settled as economic strikes. But Rochester was an example of the opposite, where the teachers and the district came very close together in terms of salary prior to the strike, but their strike occurred anyways, and it was settled in 4 days. But those of us who had been on strike who were still angry 10 years later. So that was a bad blood strike. The question I like to ask is, it's going to come down to a compromise, and neither side is going to be happy with the outcome. To me, that means that negotiations were successful, if nobody's happy, but everybody can live with it. So you can either compromise before the strike and be unhappy, or you can have a strike and have the public furious and then compromise, and what have you gained? So really the moral of the story is bite the bullet and compromise. But the other thing is to be respectful of the difference between wants and needs, and that I was surprised 2 years ago the St. Paul teachers almost came to a strike, and they were because the issue was class size. Well, I was amazed that the teachers were doing that, because class size is something that typically school districts will not negotiate about. They need to control class size because it's the most effective tool for them to control costs. If they need to save a little money, just add a few more kids to each classroom. If they've got a lot of money, they can lower those class sizes. So for them to give that away to the teachers, I was amazed that the teachers would even ask for that. But surprisingly, the school board up there gave in and gave them some control over class size. There were some myths in the teacher strikes that showed up typically on both sides of the issue. One of them being that if the public would only understood our position, they would be fully supportive of us. Well, I heard that exact same talk going on during the Minnesota orchestra strike a couple of years ago. It was, I could have almost have lifted phrases out of the newspaper and stuck them back and forth because that was a common belief, is that if only the public really understood. But Rochester and Spring Lake Park, those two strikes occurred very close to each other. Spring Lake Park got virtually no newspaper coverage. Rochester was very thoroughly covered. They both lasted about the same time. So the amount of media coverage did not make any difference. The other myth that's out there is that those people on that side of the issue who are are not really representing their constituents. And if only we could talk to their constituents, whether that be other school board members or other teachers, then I think we could really make progress. Well, they're the spokespeople because they were chosen to be the spokespeople. And it's a waste of time, really, to think that you can go make any difference by going around behind their back. It won't work. The book has been criticized both as being anti-administration and anti-teacher. So having been criticized on both sides, I feel like I probably got it about right. But there hasn't generated a lot of interest because people don't really want to talk about or think about the possibility of a teacher strike.
You might have a cup of coffee with some toast for breakfast before you go to work. But have you ever stopped to consider how such a seemingly simple device like your toaster came to be? Maynard and Marlis Jones can tell you. They are the owners of a collection of rare toasters. And if you have any intention of keeping up with the Joneses, bear in mind they have over 1,000 of them.
One thing you never know about these old toasters is that one will burn it right away and the other one just takes a few more minutes to burn it. I'm Maynard Jones and this is my wife Marlis and we collect toasters. This toaster is what got me started in collecting toasters. I went to an auction sale and they held it up, the auctioneer did, and he thought it was a toaster and I bought it for $18. Well, the Rochester Post-Bulletin had an article in the paper telling how rare it was and it was worth $525. And it's one of the toasters that all collectors really like because you bring it out, put the bread in there and let it go back. When that side's toasted, then you flip it around to the other side. And then both sides work the same way. Oh, it didn't take me long to get serious. In our collection, we have a little over 1,100 different toasters. One time my wife was gone someplace in town anyway. I was going to make myself a sandwich and I thought I'd get the toaster out and have some toast. Well, she changed where it always was and I couldn't find it, so I just forgot about it and I never even thought I had over 1,000 toasters out in the toaster shed, so I didn't have toast. This is the first American electric toaster, General Electric, 1909. And it was the first toaster device that done bread only. And on top of the early toasters, they had what you call toast racks. And if you made your toast, you set them up there to keep them warm while you made more toast.
The first pop-up toaster was made in 1926. Was made by a Minneapolis company called Waters Genter. We know the son of Mr. Waters. He held this up and said, "This sent me through college."
Today, the pop-up is basic only toaster really made. So it's not much fun collecting the newer ones, so that's why I cut off about 1950. When they first started manufacturing toasters, the General Electric 1909 was just wires and it was a percher. You just set your toast in a little basket and the element heated it and then you had to turn it. Then they started making doors and so they called them floppers. This is one of the first 4-place toasters. You put the bread in there. One side's done, then you turn it to the other side. We do go all over the country looking for toasters.
In fact, when we travel, we never stop to look at Mount Rushmore or things like that, but if it says antiques, we stop.
We collect anything that has something to do with toast. After you got started, I seen how many different toasters there were made a long time ago. Why, then I really got interested. And so I built a building. I'm a retired carpenter, and I'd have to do remodeling on houses, and I'd bring what we're supposed to throw away, so I'd bring it home and I'd build this building that we're sitting in now from recycled lumber.
We belong to the Toaster Collectors Association, and that's a group of people from all over the United States, Canada, and we even have some members from Germany. We learned about the group through a friend of ours, so we went to the first convention in 1998 and have been going ever since.
From sunup till sundown at the convention, we talk about toasters. It's hard to find good toasters. If I don't have it, I'll buy it, but then if I find one better, I'll get that one. That's why I have about 300 duplicates. So if anybody wants toasters, I have some. I don't need toast.
Funding for Off 90 is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.